began with a billionaire's joke and ended with a promise worth $100 million. In the heart of New York City, where fortunes are made and broken in the blink of an eye, one billionaire's cruel joke would spiral into something no one could have predicted. "Play this, and I'll give you $100 million, he sneered, holding up a piece of impossible music. It was meant to humiliate, a game, a spectacle for his wealthy friends. The guests laughed. The maid lowered her eyes in shame. But in the shadows of that marble mansion stood a 9-year-old girl, clutching a storybook. Her voice was small, yet unwavering. "My mommy is tired, but I can play for you." What followed stunned every guest in the room and left the billionaire facing a promise he could not afford to break. This is the story of how a maid's daughter, against all odds, challenged the arrogance of wealth, uncovered a long-buried secret, and changed everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. The polished marble floor felt cold, even through the thin soles of her worn shoes. A 9-year-old girl stood perfectly still in the enormous living room, watching her mother work. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a world of impossible wealth and silent, shimmering dust. Abigail Miller polished the grand piano with slow, careful circles. Her movements were graceful and practiced, the way a person learns to move when they are trying to be invisible. The piano was a magnificent beast of gleaming ebony wood and ivory keys, a Steinway that cost more than the small house she and her daughter rented. To Abigail, it was the heart of the mansion, a silent, sleeping giant. She hummed a quiet tune as she worked, a melody so soft it was barely more than a breath. The scent of lemon polish and old wood filled the air, a familiar smell that meant another long day was almost over. Her daughter, Chloe, stood near the grand archway that led to the hall. She was a small girl for 9 years, with hair the color of pale corn silk and eyes the color of a summer sky. She clutched a worn storybook to her chest, but she wasn't reading. Her gaze was fixed on her mother's hands, then on the piano's keys. Chloe's own small fingers twitched at her sides, pressing against the fabric of her simple dress, playing an imaginary chord. She knew the shape of the music her mother hummed. It was a lullaby, a story, a memory that lived inside both of them. The weight of the day pressed down on Abigail. It was more than just the fatigue from cleaning a house the size of a hotel. It was the weight of the letters that came in the mail, each one a stark reminder of the medical bills piling up. The doctors used long, complicated words, but the numbers at the bottom of the page were brutally simple. They were bigger than her paycheck, bigger than her hopes sometimes. But then she would look at Chloe, at her bright, curious face, and the hope would return. For Chloe, she would endure anything. She would scrub any floor, polish any surface, and make herself invisible in any room. The front door opened with a heavy click, and the quiet rhythm of their afternoon was broken. Harrison Croft strode into the room. He was a man who didn't walk so much as conquer a space. He was tall, dressed in a suit so sharp it looked like it could cut glass, and his voice boomed with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no. He was talking on his phone, a sleek black rectangle pressed to his ear, his words sharp and dismissive. "I don't care what the projections say. Buy it," he commanded. "Buy the whole company. And tell Henderson if he has a problem with it, he can take it up with my lawyers." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto a silk-upholstered armchair without looking. His eyes, cold and gray as a winter sea, swept the room and finally landed on Abigail. He didn't see a person. He saw a function, a task. "Are you done yet?" he asked. His tone wasn't just impatient. It was laced with a disdain that made Abigail's shoulders tighten. "I have guests arriving in an hour. This place needs to be perfect." "Almost finished, Mr. Croft," Abigail said, her voice soft. She kept her eyes down, focusing on a swirl in the wood grain of the piano. To be invisible was to be safe. Croft grunted and walked toward the bar in the corner of the room. He poured himself a glass of amber liquid, the ice clinking like tiny, cold bells. As he turned, he saw Chloe standing in the archway. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't used to children in his house, especially not small, silent ones who looked at him with such unnerving stillness. "What is that?" he asked, gesturing toward Chloe with his glass. Abigail's heart leaped into her throat. This is my daughter, Chloe, sir. Her school finished early today. She's being very quiet. I don't pay you to bring your family to work, he said flatly. I know, sir. It won't happen again, Abigail whispered, her face flushing with shame. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow them both. Croft took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes drifting from Chloe to Abigail, and then to the piano she was polishing. A cruel sort of amusement began to flicker in his expression. He saw her worn clothes, the smudge of polish on her cheek, the exhaustion in her posture. And he saw the way she had been looking at his piano, with a sort of quiet longing that he found pathetic. His guests began to arrive, trickling into the living room in small groups. They were people like him, men in expensive suits and women in elegant dresses, their laughter loud and brittle. They filled the grand room, their voices echoing off the high ceilings as they talked of stock markets, exotic vacations, and charity galas where they donated fractions of their wealth for a tax break and a photograph. Croft enjoyed being the center of this universe. He refilled his glass and moved to the center of the room, near the piano. He loved to hold court, to be the sun around which all these other, lesser planets revolved. He caught sight of Abigail again, who was trying to slip away unnoticed. An idea, ugly and entertaining, began to form in his mind. Everyone, he called out, his voice silencing the chatter. A moment, if you please. The guests turned toward him, their faces curious. He pointed a theatrical finger at Abigail. Our hard-working help here seems to have a deep appreciation for the finer things. His lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She's been staring at my piano all afternoon. I believe we may have a hidden talent in our midst. A few of his guests chuckled. Abigail froze, her hand hovering over the piano keys. She felt dozens of eyes on her, stripping away her cloak of invisibility. She could feel Chloe shrink back in the shadow of the doorway. What do you say? Croft continued, his voice dripping with condescending charm. Should we ask for a performance? The room filled with murmurs of amusement. Abigail shook her head slightly, her eyes pleading. No, sir. I can't. I don't play. Nonsense, Croft boomed, enjoying the spectacle. He was a showman, and this poor, flustered maid was his prop. A woman of your background. I'm sure you have soul. Music is in the soul, isn't that what they say? He walked over to the piano and picked up a piece of sheet music resting on the stand. It was a notoriously difficult piece, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, a cascade of complex notes that would challenge even a master pianist. He held it up for his guests to see. Tell you what, he said, his voice loud and clear, a proclamation for all to hear. He turned his cold, gray eyes on Abigail, the cruel smile now a full-blown sneer. I'm feeling generous tonight. He looked around at his friends, ensuring they were all watching, all witnesses to his grand, mocking gesture. Play this, he said, tapping the sheet music. Play this, and I'll give you $100 million. A wave of shocked laughter rolled through the room. It was a joke, of course, a billionaire's cruel prank. The amount was so absurd, so impossible, it was meant only to highlight the vast, uncrossable chasm between his world and hers. It was a punchline, and Abigail was the joke. Her face burned with a humiliation so intense it felt like a physical blow. She could hear the snickers, see the pitying and amused looks on the faces of the wealthy guests. She stood there, trapped in the spotlight of his mockery, her dignity stripped away. She couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. All she could do was shake her head, the shame bringing tears to her eyes. And then, a small, clear voice cut through the laughter. My mommy is tired. Every head turned. Chloe stepped out from the shadows of the archway. Her small face was serious, her blue eyes fixed on Harrison Croft. There was no fear in her expression, only a calm, unwavering resolve. She walked across the vast marble floor, her little footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. She stopped beside her mother, taking Abigail's trembling hand. Then she looked up at the billionaire, a man who could buy and sell entire countries, and spoke with a clarity that silenced the entire room. But I can play for you. The silence that followed Chloe's statement was heavy and absolute. The guests, who moments before had been laughing, now stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and confusion. They looked from the tiny, determined girl to the mortified maid, and then to Harrison Croft, who seemed, for the first time all evening, to be at a loss for words. Croft recovered quickly, a laugh barking from his chest. Well, what have we here? The little mouse has a roar. He looked around at his friends, inviting them to share in this new, even more absurd development. This gets better and better. One of his guests, a man with a booming laugh and a red face, called out, "Careful, Harrison. The girl might just take your money." The room erupted in another wave of laughter, this time directed at the child. It was a different kind of laughter, tinged with a sort of wonder at her audacity. To them, it was a charming little act of defiance, like a kitten trying to pounce on a lion. Cute, but meaningless. Abigail squeezed Chloe's hand, trying to pull her back. "Chloe, no," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Let's go, please." This was a nightmare. Her daughter was now the centerpiece of the humiliation, but Chloe didn't move. She gently pulled her hand free from her mother's grasp and looked up at Croft. "Is it a real promise?" she asked, her voice steady. "If I play the music, you'll give my mommy the money?" Croft's amusement grew. This was perfect. The humiliation would be complete. He would let the child tinkle on the keys for a minute, make a fool of herself, and then send them on their way with $100 bill for their troubles. It would be a story he'd tell for years. "It's a very real promise," he said, leaning down slightly as if speaking to a toddler. "You play that piece of music," he gestured again to the Rachmaninoff, "and your mother will never have to scrub another floor in her life. Now, do you even know how to read music, little one?" Chloe didn't answer his question. Instead, she walked to the enormous piano bench. The polished ebony seat came up to her chest. With a small grunt of effort, she climbed onto it, her legs dangling far above the pedals. She looked like a doll placed on a giant's furniture. The sheer scale of the instrument dwarfed her, making the scene even more pathetic and comical to the onlookers. She looked at the sheet music. Her small brow furrowed for a moment as she scanned the dense forest of black notes. Then, she looked up and her eyes swept across the room, past the smirking faces of the guests, until they met her mother's. She gave Abigail a small, reassuring nod, a gesture of profound love and confidence that made Abigail's heart ache. Abigail stood frozen, her mind racing. What was Chloe thinking? Chloe could play, of course. She'd been teaching her on the old, out-of-tune upright piano in their living room since she was 4. It was their special time together, the one beautiful thing in their life that debt and exhaustion couldn't touch. Chloe had a gift. Abigail knew that. She could pick up any melody by ear and play it back with a startling clarity. But this was Rachmaninoff. This was a musical Everest. It was impossible. Chloe placed her small hands on the keys. She took a deep breath, her little shoulders rising and falling. The room was utterly silent. The guests held their glasses, their conversations forgotten. They leaned in, anticipating the clumsy, childish plinking that was sure to come. Croft crossed his arms, a smug, satisfied smirk plastered on his face. He was the ringmaster, and his circus was about to reach its hilarious climax. And then, the music began. It did not start with a plink. It did not start with a mistake. The first notes flowed from the piano with a power and precision that was staggering. It was the concerto's opening, a series of chords that were famously difficult, requiring a strength and reach that Chloe's small hands should not have possessed. But she played them perfectly. Not just technically perfect, but filled with a deep, resonant melancholy. The sound filled the cavernous room, rich and full, silencing the last of the whispered jokes. Croft's smirk vanished. His arms slowly uncrossed. He took a half-step forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. The melody began to unfold, a complex tapestry of sound that Chloe wove with an effortless grace. Her fingers, which had looked so tiny and fragile, now danced across the keys with a blur of controlled speed. She moved with the confidence of a seasoned maestro, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the music. She wasn't just playing the notes on the page, she was interpreting them. She was breathing life into them. The music was filled with a sorrow so profound, a longing so intense, that it seemed impossible for it to be coming from a 9-year-old girl. The atmosphere in the room transformed. The amusement on the guests' faces was replaced by awe, then by a stunned, reverent silence. A woman in a glittering emerald dress slowly lowered her champagne flute, her mouth slightly agape. A man who was a known patron of the city's symphony orchestra leaned forward, his eyes locked on Chloe's hands, his expression one of utter bewilderment. Abigail felt tears begin to stream down her face. She wasn't crying from humiliation anymore. She was crying from a combination of pride, love, and a deep, trembling fear. She didn't understand what she was seeing. This was beyond a gift. This was something else entirely. This was not the music she had taught her daughter. The simple melodies they played together on their old, upright piano were like a child's drawing compared to this magnificent, heartbreaking masterpiece. The music swelled, reaching a thundering crescendo. The force of it seemed to vibrate through the marble floor. Chloe's small frame was a whirlwind of motion, her focus absolute. She had forgotten the room, the people, the cruel billionaire. She was alone with the music, lost in a world that only she could understand. The notes spoke of struggle, of pain, of a defiant hope that refused to be extinguished. It was the sound of a soul laid bare. As the piece reached its final, powerful chords, Chloe's playing softened. The music receded, like a great wave pulling back from the shore, leaving behind a feeling of quiet, bittersweet peace. The final note hung in the air, a perfect, shimmering sound that seemed to hold all the sorrow and beauty of the world within it. Then, there was only silence. Chloe's hands rested on the keys. She took another deep breath and finally looked up. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The spell was too powerful to be broken. The guests stood as if turned to stone, their faces etched with an emotion that went far beyond mere surprise. They had come to a party expecting cocktails and meaningless chatter. They had just witnessed a miracle. It was the symphony patron who finally broke the silence. He began to clap. Not the polite, restrained applause of the wealthy, but a powerful, explosive ovation. In a second, the entire room joined him. The grand living room was filled with the sound of thunderous applause, of shouts, of bravo. A woman was openly weeping. Another was shaking her head, muttering, "Impossible, simply impossible." Abigail rushed forward, kneeling beside the piano bench and wrapping her arms around her daughter. "Oh, Chloe," she sobbed, burying her face in her daughter's cornsilk hair. "How did you do that?" "How?" Chloe just hugged her back tightly. "I told you I could play, Mommy." Harrison Croft stood rooted to the spot, his face pale. The smug confidence had been wiped away, replaced by a complex mask of shock, confusion, and a dawning, terrifying understanding. The cruel joke he had played, the spectacle he had engineered for his own amusement, had just backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had made a promise in front of 24 of the most influential people in the city. A promise for $100 million. And a 9-year-old girl in a simple, worn dress had just met his challenge. The symphony patron, a respected older gentleman named Mr. Davison, made his way through the crowd. He stopped in front of the piano. His eyes, which had seen the greatest musicians in the world perform, were filled with a profound respect. He looked not at Croft, but at Chloe. "My dear child," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have been listening to pianists my entire life. I have never, ever heard anything like that. Where did you study? Who was your teacher?" Before Chloe could answer, another guest, a sharp-eyed woman who was a well-known journalist, turned her gaze directly on Harrison Croft. Her voice was cool and carried a distinct edge of challenge. "An excellent question," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I have another one. Mr. Croft, I believe you made a promise." Every eye in the room swiveled to Harrison Croft. He was trapped. The laughter was gone. The amusement was gone. All that remained was the echo of the impossible music and the weight of his own arrogant words. He looked at the small girl on the piano bench, and for the first time, he didn't see a maid's daughter. He saw the instrument of his own ruin. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The applause had faded, replaced by an expectant hush that was far more unnerving than the noise. Harrison Croft felt the collective gaze of his guests like a physical weight. These were not just friends. They were his peers, his rivals, the sharks with whom he swam in the deep waters of finance and society. A man's word, especially a billionaire's word, was his currency. To break a promise made so publicly was to declare bankruptcy of character. His mind, usually a sharp calculator of risk and reward, was a frantic storm. $100 million. The sum was staggering, even for him. It was a significant portion of liquid capital, not just a number on a spreadsheet. Handing it over for a party trick, a joke gone wrong, was unthinkable. It was a humiliating, catastrophic loss. But the alternative was worse. The story would be all over the city by morning. Harrison Croft, the tycoon who tried to humiliate a maid and her child, then welched on his own bet. His reputation would be shattered. Every deal, every negotiation would be tainted by the knowledge that his word was worthless. He looked at Chloe, who was now safely enfolded in her mother's arms, peering at him with those impossibly calm blue eyes. There was no triumph in her gaze, no childish glee. There was just stillness. It was the stillness that unnerved him the most. "A promise is a promise," Mr. Davison said, his voice a low rumble of authority. He was an old money figure, a man whose respect Croft had long courted. To lose his endorsement was to lose a pillar of his social standing. "We all heard it, Harrison." Loud and clear. Croft forced a laugh. It sounded strained and hollow in the silent room. Of course. Of course. A joke, certainly, but a promise nonetheless. He tried to regain control of the situation, to frame it as an act of his own grand generosity rather than a trap he had sprung on himself. The little prodigy here certainly delivered. He walked toward Abigail and Chloe, pulling out a slim checkbook and a gold pin from his jacket pocket. The act was pure theater. He wanted them all to see him making good on his word. But as he clicked the pen, he paused. A sliver of suspicion, a way out, presented itself. "However," he said, his voice regaining some of its familiar, commanding tone, "this is a rather unusual situation. No one," he swept his gaze across the room, "and I mean no one, can play Rachmaninoff like that without years, decades, of formal training at the highest level. Certainly not a 9-year-old girl." He looked down at Chloe. "So tell me, who is your teacher? Where did you really learn to play like that? Did someone put you up to this?" The insinuation was clear. This was a trick, a pre-planned scam. Abigail bristled, her protective instincts overriding her fear. "No one put her up to anything," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I taught her. On our old piano at home." Croft let out a disbelieving scoff. "You taught her? A maid taught her to play like a virtuoso who could headline at Carnegie Hall? Forgive me if I find that a little hard to believe." "It's true," Chloe said softly. "Mommy hums the songs, and I play them." This statement, so simple and so utterly unbelievable, only deepened the mystery. Mr. Davison knelt down, so he was at eye level with Chloe. His expression was no longer just impressed. It was intensely curious. "My dear," he said gently, "the piece you played, it's one of the most difficult in the classical repertoire. It's not a song one can simply hum. You read the music." I looked at it. Chloe corrected him politely. "But I already knew the story." "The story?" Mr. Davison asked, puzzled. "Every song has a story," Chloe explained, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "That one is about a man who is very far from home. He's sad, but he remembers the fields and the river from when he was a boy. He has to keep fighting, but he never forgets the way home." A stunned silence fell over the room again. Chloe hadn't just played the music. She had understood its soul. She had articulated the emotional core of the concerto with a child's simple words, yet with more insight than many seasoned music critics. Abigail felt a flicker of memory. The story Chloe told, it was so familiar. It wasn't the story of Rachmaninoff. It was the story her own grandfather used to tell her. Her grandfather, Frank Miller. Before Abigail could speak, Harrison Croft, growing more desperate, saw another angle. "This is absurd. She's a child. I'm not writing a check for $100 million based on a party performance." He turned to Abigail, his tone hardening, becoming cruel again. "What is this, really? A shakedown? You knew my guests were coming. You coached your daughter to play something to embarrass me, to extort me. That's not true." Abigail cried, holding Chloe tighter. "We would never." "Enough." Mr. Davison's voice cut through the air like a whip. He stood up and faced Croft, his face a mask of cold fury. "Harrison, your behavior tonight has been appalling. You tried to make a spectacle of this woman for your own amusement. You used her child as a pawn in your cruel game. And now that you've lost, you accuse them of fraud? You disgrace yourself." The journalist woman stepped forward, her phone held discreetly at her side, though everyone knew it was recording. "I, for one, would love to write the story of Chloe Miller," she said, her voice sweet as poison. "The 9-year-old prodigy discovered in a billionaire's mansion. The world will want to know who she is." And they will certainly want to know how the billionaire who discovered her honored his very public promise. Checkmate. Croft knew he was beaten. The story would not be about his generosity now. It would be about his cruelty and his reluctance to pay. The journalist would make sure of that. He was trapped from every angle. His face was a thundercloud of rage and humiliation. He snatched the checkbook and scribbled furiously. The scratching of the gold pen on the paper was the only sound in the room. He ripped the check out and, without looking at Abigail, thrust it at her. Here, he spat. Take it. Now get out of my house. Abigail stared at the slip of paper in her hand. The number written on it was so long it looked like a mistake. $100 million. It was an impossible sum, a fairy tale number. It could solve every problem she had, and 1,000 more she hadn't even thought of. It was safety. It was freedom. It was a future for her daughter. But as she looked at it, she didn't feel the rush of joy she might have expected. She felt a profound sense of unease. This money was born for mockery. It was tainted with humiliation. And something about the situation, about the music and the story Chloe told, felt deeply, strangely connected to her own past. She looked at her daughter, then at the check, and then back at Harrison Croft, who was watching her with venomous eyes. There is one thing, Abigail said, her voice quiet but clear, finding a strength she never knew she possessed. The music. Where did you get that specific copy? Croft looked baffled by the question. What does it matter? It was part of an estate I acquired years ago. An old collection. What? My grandfather. Abigail began, her voice trembling as the pieces of a long-forgotten family history began to click into place. He was a soldier. Sergeant Frank Miller. He fought in Europe during the Second World War. He used to tell me stories about the people he met, the things he saw. There was a composer he saved, a man who lost everything. Before the man fled, he played my grandfather a piece of music, a new concerto he had written. He said it was about never forgetting home. Mr. Davison's eyes widened. Sergeant Frank Miller? The Angel of Ardennes? He was a legendary hero. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. Croft's expression shifted from anger to a flicker of something else. Recognition. The name Miller, connected to that war, to that region. It stirred a dark, buried piece of his own family's history. His grandfather, the industrialist, had made his first fortune from salvaging assets in post-war Europe. My grandfather hummed that tune for the rest of his life. Abigail continued, her voice growing stronger. My mother hummed it to me, and I hummed it to Chloe. It's our family's song. She looked directly at Croft. That composer, he never made it out of the country. He and his music were thought to be lost forever. That sheet music isn't just old paper, Mr. Croft. It's a man's soul, and my grandfather's memory. The implication hung heavy in the air. The long-lost masterpiece, a priceless piece of cultural history, had somehow ended up in the hands of Harrison Croft, whose family had profited from the same conflict that had destroyed the composer's life. And the only person in the world who could recognize its melody was the great-granddaughter of the war hero who had heard it last. Chloe, the little girl who could hear the stories in the music, had not just performed a concerto. She had channeled a ghost. She had given voice to a history that connected the hero and the profiteer, the maid and the billionaire, in a way that no one could have ever imagined. The check in Abigail's hand suddenly felt less like a prize and more like a ransom. The story was no longer just about a cruel joke and a brilliant child. It was about justice, history, and a debt that went far beyond $100 million. Harrison Croft's face, moments before a canvas of rage, was now ashen. The name Frank Miller and the mention of the Angel of Ardennes had struck a chord deep within him, a dissonant, ugly note from his family's closely guarded history. His grandfather, Alistair Croft, was a celebrated industrialist, a man lauded for his business acumen in rebuilding after the war. The official story was one of brilliant investments and shrewd acquisitions. But there were other stories, whispers in the family that were never spoken aloud, of opportunism, of acquiring art, property, and businesses from displaced or deceased owners for pennies on the dollar. Of salvaging, as his grandfather had delicately put it. He stared at the sheet music, still resting on the piano. It wasn't just a prop and a cruel joke anymore. It was evidence. A ghost from a past he had profited from but never had to confront. The journalist, whose name was Evelyn Reed, saw the flicker of recognition and fear in Croft's eyes. She moved slightly, a predator sensing a weakness. "This is an extraordinary story, Mrs. Miller," Evelyn said, her voice now filled with a professional, sympathetic warmth that was far more dangerous to Croft than her previous venom. "A lost masterpiece, a war hero, a family legacy. It's a story that deserves to be told." She glanced at Croft. "And all its parts." Mr. Davison, the symphony patron, stepped forward. He had a new purpose in his eyes. He was no longer just a party guest. He was a custodian of culture. "Mrs. Miller, what you and your daughter have uncovered, it could be one of the most significant musical finds of the century. This isn't a private matter anymore." He looked at Croft with undisguised contempt. "This music does not belong to you, Harrison. It belongs to the world. And it belongs to the memory of the man who wrote it." The other guests, who had been silent observers, now began to murmur amongst themselves. The nature of the evening had shifted irrevocably. They were no longer at a billionaire's party. They were witnesses to a historical unraveling. Alliances were subtly shifting. The pitying looks they had given Abigail were replaced by expressions of respect and intrigue. They were distancing themselves from Croft, moving away from the toxic fallout of his arrogance. Croft, a man who controlled boardrooms and dominated negotiations, was losing control of his own living room. He tried to rally. "This is all speculation," he said, his voice a low growl. "A sentimental story based on a half-remembered tune. You have no proof of any of this." "I have my grandfather's letters," Abigail replied, the words coming to her as if from a dream. She hadn't thought of them in years. They were in a dusty box in her closet, tied with a faded ribbon. "He wrote to my grandmother about everything. He wrote about the soldiers' songs, the villages, and the quiet, sad man who played the piano for him in a bombed-out church." Her voice gained strength with each word. "He wrote about a melody that sounded like a prayer for home." The check for $100 million felt heavy and wrong in her hand. This money, she realized, wasn't a prize. It was a price. It was the price of her silence, the value Croft had placed on making this entire, inconvenient history disappear. He hadn't given it to her to honor a promise, but to buy her compliance. With a clarity that felt both terrifying and liberating, Abigail walked forward and placed the check on the polished lid of the grand piano. The crisp slip of paper looked small and insignificant against the vast, dark wood. "We don't want your money, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "We want the music." Chloe, still holding her mother's hand, looked up at Croft and said, "It's not your story to keep." The simple, profound truth of the child's statement hung in the air. Croft was stunned into silence. He had expected greed, tears of gratitude, a quick and quiet exit. He had not expected this. He had not expected dignity. Refusing $100 million was a move so far outside his understanding of the world that he couldn't process it. To him, everything and everyone had a price. Mr. Davison placed a gentle hand on Abigail's shoulder. "Mrs. Miller, you are doing the right thing. Do not worry. You and your daughter will not be left to face this alone." He pulled out a business card. "I have connections at the National Archives, at the finest music conservatories in the world. We will verify the authenticity of this manuscript. We will find the composer's history, and we will see that your grandfather's legacy and the legacy of the man he tried to save are honored." Evelyn Reed stepped forward as well. "And I will make sure the world is watching," she said, giving Abigail a card of her own. "He can't intimidate you now. The story is already bigger than he is." The party was over. The guests began to leave, not with the boisterous goodbyes of a social gathering, but with quiet, meaningful nods to Abigail. They avoided looking at Harrison Croft, who stood isolated in the center of his opulent room, a king who had suddenly lost his kingdom. He was surrounded by wealth, but he had never looked poorer. As Abigail and Chloe prepared to leave, one of Croft's household staff, a butler who had worked for him for 20 years, approached them quietly. He had a kind, tired face. "Ma'am," he whispered to Abigail, "your final paycheck. Mr. Croft asked me to tell you that your services are no longer required." He handed her an envelope. It was a paltry sum, the legal minimum, a final, petty act of spite. Abigail took the envelope without a word. She had been fired. She had no job, and she had just refused a sum of money that could have solved all her problems. For a fleeting moment, a wave of panic washed over her. The medical bills were still real. The rent was still due. Then she looked down at Chloe, who was watching her with complete trust. And she looked at the piano, at the sheet music that held a story of survival and memory. She felt a deep, unshakable calm settle over her. They had something more valuable than money. They had the truth. As they walked out of the grand mansion and into the cool night air, leaving the world of cold marble and colder hearts behind them, Abigail knew their lives had been changed forever. The fight was far from over. It had just begun. But for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't just a maid trying to be invisible. She was Sergeant Frank Miller's granddaughter. And she had a story to tell. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The world Abigail and Chloe had known. A small, quiet life governed by work schedules and the constant anxiety of bills vanished. It was replaced by a new reality of phone calls, meetings, and the slowly dawning realization that they were at the center of a storm. Evelyn Reed's article was the opening salvo. It appeared on the front page of a major online news outlet, under a headline that was both sensational and utterly true. The Billionaire, the Maid, and the Lost Masterpiece. The story was a masterclass in narrative journalism. It began with the image of 9-year-old Chloe, her small hands on the keys of a grand piano, and unfolded the tale of a cruel party joke that had accidentally unearthed a historical treasure. It wove together the threads of the heroic Sergeant Frank Miller, the mysterious, unnamed composer, and the Croft family's shadowy post-war fortune. Evelyn didn't make direct accusations, but she posed sharp, uncomfortable questions that cast a long, dark shadow over Harrison Croft's reputation. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The story went viral. Chloe's Concerto, as the media dubbed it, became a trending topic. People were captivated by the David and Goliath nature of the story, the quiet, dignified maid and her prodigy daughter standing up to a ruthless billionaire. Support for Abigail and Chloe poured in from all corners of the country. A crowdfunding page, started by an anonymous supporter, raised tens of thousands of dollars within hours to help with their immediate living expenses and medical bills. Abigail was overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers. For years, she had felt alone, invisible. Now, she felt seen. Meanwhile, Mr. Davison was true to his word. He assembled a small, dedicated team. A renowned musicologist from Juilliard, a historian specializing in World War II art and property displacement, and a team of pro bono lawyers from a prestigious firm. Their headquarters became a quiet corner of the city's historical society, a room filled with the scent of old books and righteous purpose. Abigail brought them the box of her grandfather's letters. With trembling hands, she and the historian, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Al-Jamil, read through the fragile, ink-stained pages. Frank Miller's voice emerged from the past, a young man riding home from a world of unimaginable chaos. He wrote of the cold, the fear, and the small moments of humanity that kept him going. And then they found it. A series of letters from late 1944, written from a makeshift field hospital in a Belgian town near the Ardennes forest. "Dearest Eleanor," he wrote to his wife, "there is a man here. They brought him in last week. His name is Leo. He doesn't talk much, but he has music in his hands. The village priest says he was a famous composer back in Vienna before the darkness fell. He lost his wife, his children, everything. All he has left is a satchel of paper covered in notes. He guards it like it's his own heart." A few days later, another letter. "Leo played for us tonight. There's an old piano in the church that somehow survived the shelling. He played a piece he wrote. He calls it The River's Memory. He said it's the sound of the Danube, so he'll never forget the way home. I wish you could hear it, Ellie. It's the saddest and most beautiful thing I've ever heard. It sounds like hope with a broken heart." The final letter about Leo was short and grim. "We had to evacuate. The fighting is getting closer. Leo wouldn't leave his music. I tried to make him come, but he was too weak, too lost in his grief. He made me promise to remember his song. He pressed the sheet music into my hands, but in the chaos, I had to leave it behind. I only managed to keep the first page. I feel like I failed him. I pray that somehow his music survives." Tucked into the envelope with that letter was a single, yellowed page of sheet music. The handwriting was a match to the manuscript from Croft's piano. The musicologist confirmed it was the opening of the concerto. They had their proof. The composer had a name, Leo Richter, a once celebrated Viennese composer whose work was thought to have been completely lost during the war. The news of the discovery and the authentication of the concerto sent shockwaves through the classical music world. It was, as Mr. Davison had predicted, the find of a lifetime. Museums, orchestras, and universities from around the globe clamored for a chance to see the manuscript. For Harrison Croft, the storm was just beginning. The story was no longer just about a broken promise. It was about his family's potential connection to war profiteering. Investigative journalists began digging into Alistair Croft's post-war acquisitions. Questions were being asked in government circles. The carefully constructed facade of the Croft dynasty was beginning to crack. He was hemorrhaging money and, more importantly, prestige. Business partners grew wary. Stocks in his flagship company dipped. The social invitations dried up. He was a pariah in the world he had once ruled. He tried to fight back. His lawyers issued statements denying any wrongdoing, claiming the manuscript was acquired legally as part of a larger estate purchase and that he was the victim of a media smear campaign. He even tried to position himself as a patron of the arts, offering to donate the manuscript to a museum, a transparent attempt to whitewash his image. But it was too late. The narrative was set. He was the villain in a story that had captured the world's imagination. Throughout it all, Chloe remained the calm center of the storm. She didn't fully grasp the financial or historical implications, but she understood the important parts. She understood that her grandfather was a hero. She understood that a man named Leo had lost his home, and his music was a way to find it again. And she understood that Mr. Croft had tried to keep that music quiet, which was wrong. She spent her days with her mother in the quiet offices of the Historical Society. While the adults spoke in hushed, serious tones, Chloe would sit at an old, upright piano in the corner, the same kind they had at home. She didn't play the grand, thundering concerto. She played the simple melody from its heart, the theme Leo Richter had called the river's memory. She played it softly, filling the room not with spectacle, but with a feeling of profound peace. One afternoon, Mr. Davison found Abigail watching her daughter, a look of worry on her face. "What is it, my dear?" he asked gently. "All of this." Abigail gestured vaguely. "The news, the lawyers, it's for her. For her future. But I worry it's too much. She's just a little girl." Mr. Davison watched Chloe play for a moment. Her eyes were closed, her face serene. She was lost in the story of the music. "A little girl," he said, a smile touching his lips, "who reminded all of us what is truly valuable. Money, power, mansions, they are fleeting. But a story, a memory, a piece of music that speaks to the soul, that is eternal. She is not just a part of this story, Abigail. She is its heart." He was right, but the heart was fragile. And Abigail knew that Harrison Croft was a man who, when cornered, would not hesitate to strike at the heart. The legal battle for the manuscript was about to begin, and she feared that Croft's desperation would make him more dangerous than ever. She had won the court of public opinion, but the real fight, the one that would take place in a courtroom of cold, hard law, was still to come. The initial legal filings from Harrison Croft's legal team were as brutal and expensive as expected. They were a barrage of motions and counterclaims designed to overwhelm, intimidate, and bankrupt. The documents painted Abigail not as a hero, but as a cunning opportunist. They claimed she was the mastermind of an elaborate fraud, that she had coached her supposedly gifted daughter to memorize a single, obscure piece of music to extort money from a benevolent philanthropist. They even stooped to character assassination, digging into Abigail's financial struggles and presenting her medical debt not as a burden, but as a motive for a crime. Reading the words on the thick, formal paper made Abigail feel sick. They twisted her reality into something ugly and unrecognizable. The small, worn dress Chloe had been wearing was described as a costume designed to elicit sympathy. Her quiet dignity in the face of Croft's mockery was reframed as a calculated, theatrical performance. "This is standard procedure for men like Croft," their lead lawyer, a calm, silver-haired man named Ben Carter, told her. "The strategy is scorched earth. They want to make the process so painful and so expensive that you give up." "But it's all lies," Abigail said, her voice small. "I know," Ben said, his eyes kind but firm. "And our job is to prove it. But you need to be prepared, Abigail. They will come after you, your past, your family. They will try to break you." The pressure was immense. The media attention, which had once felt like a protective shield, now felt like a suffocating weight. Photographers would sometimes wait outside the temporary apartment Mr. Davison had arranged for them. Every trip to the grocery store was a potential spectacle. Abigail saw the way other parents at the park would whisper and point. Some were supportive, but others looked at her with suspicion, their minds poisoned by the headlines and tabloid papers that Croft's PR machine was feeding. She began to have nightmares. Not of Croft, but of the letters, the medical bills, the fear of not being able to provide for Chloe. The $100 million check she had placed on that piano haunted her. Had she been a fool? Had she sacrificed her daughter's security for a principle that the world was too cynical to care about? Her anxiety began to affect Chloe. The little girl, who had been so fearless in the mansion, grew quiet and withdrawn. She stopped wanting to go to the park. She had trouble sleeping. One evening, Abigail found her sitting at the piano in their apartment, not playing, but just staring at the keys, her small shoulders slumped. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Abigail asked, kneeling beside her. "The news people. They said I was a liar," Chloe whispered, her lower lip trembling. "They said I didn't hear the story in the music. They said you just made me learn it to get money." Abigail's heart broke. This was her greatest fear realized. Her fight for justice was costing her daughter her peace. She wrapped her arms around Chloe, holding her tight. "Listen to me," she said, her voice fierce. "You have a gift that those people could never understand. You heard the truth, and we are not going to let anyone, especially not a bully like Mr. Croft, take that away from you. Or from Leo." The name Leo seemed to refocus Chloe. "We have to help Leo's music get home," she said, her voice regaining a little of its usual determination. "That's right," Abigail said, kissing the top of her head. "And we will." The turning point in the legal battle came during the deposition phase. Croft's lawyers had demanded to question Chloe. Ben Carter had fought it furiously, arguing that putting a 9-year-old through a hostile cross-examination was cruel and unnecessary. But the judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman, reluctantly allowed it, with strict limitations. The deposition would take place in an informal setting, a neutral conference room, with a child psychologist present. Harrison Croft insisted on being there. He sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, flanked by his team of lawyers. He looked thinner, his face etched with the stress of the past few weeks. His empire was under siege, and his obsession with this case had grown. He was no longer just trying to save money. He was trying to salvage his pride, to punish the people who had dared to humiliate him. Abigail sat beside Chloe, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's back. Ben Carter sat on Chloe's other side, a calm, reassuring presence. Croft's lead lawyer, a man with a perpetually sneering expression named Marcus Thorne, began the questioning. He started with soft, seemingly innocuous questions about Chloe's school, her friends, her favorite things to do. Then, he steered toward the piano. "So, Chloe," Thorne said, leaning forward with a fake, friendly smile. "Your mommy taught you how to play, is that right?" "Yes," Chloe said. "And she worked very hard to teach you the special song you played at Mr. Croft's house, didn't she? You must have practiced it for a very, very long time." "No," Chloe said simply. Thorne paused. "No, I didn't practice it," Chloe said. "I looked at the paper. I heard the story, and then I played it." "You heard the story," Thorne repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And what was this story you heard?" Chloe recounted the same story she had told in the mansion, about the man who was far from home and remembered the river. Thorne smirked. "That's a very nice story, Chloe. A very sad story. Is that the story your mother told you to remember?" "No," Chloe said, her brow furrowing. "That's just the story the music told me." Thorne decided to set his trap. "Chloe, you said you just looked at the music on the piano. Is that right?" "Yes." "And you had never seen it before that night?" "Never." Thorne picked up a folder and pulled out a piece of sheet music. He placed it in front of Chloe. It was another complex piece, a frantic, dissonant composition by a modern avant-garde composer. It was a chaotic mess of notes, deliberately jarring and devoid of traditional melody. "Can you play this for us, Chloe? Can you tell us the story in this music?" Ben Carter stood up. "Objection. This is a ridiculous stunt. She's not a jukebox." But before the psychologist could intervene, Chloe looked at the sheet music. She stared at it for a full minute, her head tilted. The room was silent. Croft leaned forward, a hungry, expectant look on his face. This was it. The moment the fraud would be exposed. The child would either admit she couldn't play it, or she would try and fail miserably. Finally, Chloe looked up at Thorne. "This music is very loud," she said. "Loud?" Thorne asked, confused. "It's a story about a big city," Chloe continued, her voice quiet and thoughtful. "The cars are all honking, and the people are rushing, and no one is listening to anyone else. Everyone is shouting, but no one has anything to say. It's a very lonely story." She looked at the music again, then shook her head. "I don't like it. It doesn't have a heart." She didn't touch the piano. She didn't need to. With a few simple sentences, she had perfectly captured the emotional essence of the piece. She had seen past the technical complexity to the soul of the music, or in this case, the lack of one. The musicologist on their team, who was observing the deposition, let out a small, audible gasp. Thorne was speechless. His perfect trap had not only failed, it had backfired, providing even more stunning evidence of Chloe's inexplicable gift. Harrison Croft slammed his hand on the table, his face purple with rage. "Enough of this circus," he roared. "She's a freak. They're all charlatans." The outburst sealed his fate. The psychologist immediately ended the deposition, citing the hostile environment Croft had created. The transcript of the event, particularly Chloe's stunning analysis and Croft's subsequent meltdown, was devastating. It painted him as an unhinged bully and Chloe as a calm, preternaturally gifted child. The legal tide had turned. Croft's lawyers, recognizing that putting Chloe on a witness stand in a public trial would be a complete disaster for their client, advised him to seek a settlement. But Croft refused. His pride was too wounded. He had become a prisoner of his own vendetta. He funneled more and more money into the legal fight, liquidating assets and neglecting his businesses, which were already suffering from the negative publicity. He became isolated, firing advisors who told him to cut his losses. He would sit alone in his vast, silent mansion, drinking too much and staring at the grand piano that had started his downfall, as if it were a monument to his own folly. The case was scheduled for trial. Abigail was terrified, but she drew strength from her daughter and the team that had assembled around them. They were no longer just fighting for a piece of music. They were fighting for the principle that truth was more powerful than wealth, and that decency could, in the end, triumph over cruelty. On the morning the trial was set to begin, as Abigail was getting Chloe ready, a special delivery arrived. It was a long, flat box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a simple but beautifully made blue dress, exactly Chloe's size. The attached card had no name, only a typed message. "The world is listening. Make them hear the music." Abigail knew it was from one of their countless anonymous supporters. As she helped Chloe put on the dress, she felt a surge of gratitude that pushed away her fear. They were not alone. They walked into the courthouse, past a throng of reporters and cameras, their hands held tightly together. They were David walking into the lion's den, but they were not afraid. They had their story, they had their truth, and they had a song that had waited more than half a century to finally be heard. The courtroom was a study in contrasts. On one side sat Harrison Croft and his phalanx of lawyers, their dark suits symbols of corporate power. Croft's face was a stony mask, a vein pulsing in his temple. On the other side sat Abigail and Chloe, looking small but surrounded by their own quiet army. Ben Carter, calm and prepared. Mr. Davison, his distinguished presence lending them gravitas. And Dr. Al-Jamil, ready to testify with Frank Miller's letters. Croft's lawyers were aggressive, painting Abigail as a disgruntled employee with a history of financial instability. They presented experts who testified on the statistical improbability of a child prodigy appearing without intensive training. They were building a fortress of doubt, brick by cynical brick. When it was Ben Carter's turn, he told a story. He told the jury about Sergeant Frank Miller and a brilliant, lost composer named Leo Richter. "This case," Ben said, his voice low and steady, "is not about money. Harrison Croft wants you to believe it is, because money is the only language he speaks. This case is about memory. It's about a promise made in a bombed-out church, a promise to remember a song." He then called his only witness. The plaintiff calls Chloe Miller to the stand. A murmur went through the courtroom. Chloe walked to the witness stand, her small legs barely reaching the floor. Ben approached her gently. "Mr. Croft and his lawyers say you couldn't have played that music. They say you must have cheated somehow. What do you say to that? Chloe looked at the jury, her blue eyes clear. Music isn't a cheat, she said. It's a feeling. Ben Carter then received the judge's permission for a demonstration. The magnificent Steinway Grand was wheeled into the courtroom and placed directly in front of the jury. Chloe walked to the piano and climbed onto the bench, a tiny figure before the immense instrument. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft rustle of clothing. Ben handed a sealed envelope to the judge. Your Honor, this is a piece of music selected this morning by an independent expert. No one in this room, including Chloe, has seen it. The judge opened the envelope and placed the sheet music on the piano stand. It was a complex, lyrical piece by Debussy. Chloe looked at it for a long moment. Then, her hands touched the keys. The music filled the courtroom, not with thundering passion, but with a dreamy, shimmering beauty. It was a completely different piece, with a different soul. And Chloe played it with the same impossible, intuitive understanding. The jurors were mesmerized, their faces a mixture of wonder and disbelief. When the last, delicate note faded, a profound silence held the room. It was broken by the sound of a single juror, a woman in the front row, who let out a sob she could no longer contain. Chloe's demonstration had washed away the fortress of doubt with a simple, undeniable truth. The jury deliberated for less than 20 minutes. Their verdict was unanimous. They found in favor of Abigail Miller, affirming her claim to the manuscript's legacy. The judge declared the composition, The River's Memory, a priceless piece of cultural heritage and ordered it placed in a public trust. Abigail and Mr. Davison were appointed to its board. Harrison Croft sat motionless as the verdict was read. He stared at the small, empty piano bench. He had wagered everything against a 9-year-old girl, and she had beaten him with a song. 2 years later, the lights of Carnegie Hall gleamed. Inside, a sold-out crowd buzzed with anticipation for the world premiere of Leo Richter's long-lost piano concerto No. 1, The River's Memory. In a box seat, Abigail Miller sat beside a healthy, beaming Mr. Davison. The medical bills were a distant memory, paid for by the foundation that also provided her a modest salary. The house lights dimmed. A figure walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. Chloe was 11 now, poised, dressed in a simple blue gown. She bowed, and after sharing a smile with her mother, she sat at the Steinway. Then, she began to play. The music of The River's Memory swelled, filling the legendary hall with sorrow and resilience, loss and hope. It was Leo Richter's story. It was Sergeant Frank Miller's memory. It was Chloe's gift. The concerto was a triumph. As the final note echoed and the audience leaped to its feet in a roaring standing ovation, Abigail looked at her daughter, whose face glowed with a pure, bright joy. She thought of the journey that had brought them there, from the cold marble floor of a billionaire's mansion to this hallowed stage. The greatest gifts were not those that could be bought or sold, but those passed down, heart to heart, like a half-remembered lullaby. It was a melody that had traveled through war and time to find its home at last, in the hands of a little girl who knew how to listen. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.